The final night in Baghdad. Was it truly a night of peace or just the first whisper of silence? How did the Mongols bring an entire royal family to the ground, erasing the meaning of their power? In this moment of unbearable cruelty, the world has never forgotten it. Are you ready to witness the secret? You step onto polished stone that still holds the day's warmth. Somewhere nearby, water should be singing fountains, channels, the soft certainty that the world is still in order. But tonight, there is only silence. A servant hurries past with his eyes down, clutching a lamp as if the flame might be stolen by the dark. Far beyond the walls, the horizon isn't empty, it's moving. A low thunder travels through the ground, not from the sky, but from thousands of hooves pressing time forward like a verdict. You can't see the army yet. You only feel it. The city feels it. Even the palace does, its corridors suddenly too long, its gold suddenly too cold. And somewhere inside those walls, a royal family is still pretending that titles can stop a tide. Before we go deeper, tell me where you're watching from seriously. It still amazes me that one city's last night can echo across the whole planet. Now pull back the curtain. This is Baghdad, once the beating heart of the Islamic world, a city that didn't merely rule. It organized reality. Here, law and theology were argued like living things. Here, merchants measured distance in languages. Here, scholars believed ink could outlast empires. And at the center sat the Abbasid Caliph Al-Mustasim, a ruler wrapped in ceremony, surrounded by the perfume of permanence. But outside Baghdad, permanence had already died. In the year 1258, the Mongol advance reached the gates under Hulagu Khan, a commander whose name traveled faster than his army because people didn't talk about what he conquered. They talked about what was left afterward. And what makes the fall of Baghdad so haunting isn't only that a city fell. It's what happened when the city's highest family, symbols of divine authority, tradition, and continuity, was placed in the hands of men who did not fear those symbols at all. Because here's the paradox that drives this story. When an empire collapses, you expect chaos. But what unfolded in Baghdad was something colder, a kind of method, a kind of message. In the final days, Baghdad didn't feel like it was waiting for a battle. It felt like it was waiting for a sentence. The streets still filled, markets still argued. In courtyards, birds still hopped through shadows like nothing had changed. But in the palace, the air was different. There are moments in history where the smallest detail becomes an omen, where the body senses what the mind refuses to accept, a fountain that stops, a corridor that suddenly feels like a tunnel, a door that closes with a sound too loud. And the Caliph Al-Mustasim was a man trained to believe that the universe had an order, and that order placed him above certain outcomes. He had inherited an ancient institution that once commanded armies and provinces, but by his time, much of that real power had leaked away into rival courts, military strongmen, and distant governors. Still, the title mattered. It mattered to millions. It mattered inside Baghdad's walls like a spell you repeat when you're afraid. The Mongols did not care about spells. Hulag's army arrived not just with riders, but with engineers, siege specialists, pulled from the Mongol world's conquered edges. The Mongols were often imagined as pure horse and bow, but their campaigns by this era had absorbed technology and expertise like a storm absorbs debris. Baghdad's defenders watched the horizon change shape as the invaders built their machines. Wood became towers. Rope became tension, stone became ammunition, and then the bombardment began. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in a rhythm, impact after impact, day after day, until the city's confidence started to break down into smaller emotions: fear, exhaustion, denial, bargaining. The kind of bargaining people do with invisible forces. If we endure one more night, something will happen. Someone will arrive. God will intervene. The enemy will retreat. Inside the palace, the bargaining took a different form. Advisors and courtiers measured danger against dignity. Some urged surrender, open the gates, preserve the bloodline, accept humiliation today to survive tomorrow. Others insisted that surrender would be a sacrilege, that the caliphate's prestige was a wall stronger than stone. And in every empire's last week, there are always people who are loyal not to reality, but to the story they've been telling themselves. The siege tightened. Baghdad had been a city that lived on water, the Tigris, the canals, the engineered flow that made gardens possible, that made urban life feel like a miracle. Now the water became strategic. Control of water became control of time. Control of time became control of panic. The Mongols did what they always did when facing walls. They turned the world around the walls into a weapon. And then came the moment that always arrives in these stories, the moment when the defenders realize the walls are no longer the city's skin, but merely its scenery. A breach isn't just a physical hole. It's a psychological collapse. Once the idea of safety breaks, everything changes. A gate can hold. A belief can't. By the time Baghdad's resistance crumpled, it wasn't because the defenders lacked courage. It was because the Mongol war machine had become something beyond conventional war, a moving system for ending alternatives. You didn't merely lose to it. You were erased by it. When Hulagu entered Baghdad, the city had already begun to die in the minds of those inside it. But the palace still stood. There is a unique terror in being conquered when you have been raised to believe you cannot be touched. A caliph wasn't merely a man in robes. He was the idea of continuity made flesh. His household wasn't just a family, it was a sacred chain. And then, abruptly, it became a captive household. The throne room that had hosted diplomacy and ceremony now hosted something else, a recalculation of the universe. The conqueror and the conquered facing each other like two incompatible laws of nature. Accounts differ in their details. History often does when shame and horror are involved, but they agree on the atmosphere. Humiliation was not incidental. It was purposeful. A performance staged for the future. The caliph was brought forward. His world collapsed in a way that no battlefield death could match, not slain in glory, not martyred in resistance, but reduced to a man standing beneath another man's gaze. And in that gaze was an idea the caliph had never truly believed could exist. What if sacred authority is only sacred to those who consent to it? Hulagu did not need to shout. He did not need to prove he was powerful. Power was already arranged outside the walls in tense cavalry lines and silent discipline. In the throne room, he needed something else. He needed an ending that would travel, because empires don't just win by killing armies. They win by killing the will to resist in everyone who hears the story afterward. So the Mongols made the caliph's body into a message. Not simply death message. In Mongol tradition, there was a superstition about spilling royal blood onto the earth. Whether it was spiritual fear or political theater, the result was the same. They preferred executions that avoided visible bloodshed. It's one of those details that feels almost surreal, like the universe still insisting on ritual, even as it commits atrocity. And if that tradition sounds merciful, it wasn't. It was a way to kill while keeping the ground clean, a way to maintain the conqueror's worldview intact while destroying someone else's. The Caliph's sons were brought out. In many retellings they are portrayed as young one barely more than a boy, and that youth matters because it makes the moment feel even more like a guillotine falling on the future itself. A dynasty isn't a single man, it's a line. The Mongols understood that if you cut the line in public, you don't just end a reign. You end an idea. Imagine the room. Imagine being a father and watching guards reposition your children like objects. Imagine the sound of fabric being unfurled carpets, thick and heavy, the kind once meant for prayer or luxury, now repurposed for death. This is where the story becomes difficult to hold in your mind, because the method is so intimate. The princes wrapped tightly, movement stolen, air reduced, were killed without the traditional spectacle of blood. The violence was muffled. The room could remain orderly. The witnesses could never claim the floor was stained, even if their memories were, and the Caliph, forced to witness it, became the audience for his own extinction. But the true, shocking truth people return to, over and over, is not just that the sons died. It's that the Mongols didn't stop at removing a political rival. They went after the royal family as a symbol, wives, daughters, household members, because symbols are what people swear loyalty to. If you want to rule the living, you first dismantle what the living believe is untouchable. So the women of the court were brought into the story, too pulled from seclusion into the raw glare of conquest. In palace life, the women of the caliphal household represented lineage and honor, the continuity of legitimacy. To violate that continuity wasn't only cruelty, it was strategy. It was conquest aimed at the social soul. Many medieval chroniclers, even when describing massacres, become evasive when they reach this part. They hint, they gesture, they use silence as a veil. And that silence is its own testimony. It tells you the writers either could not bear to record what they knew, or knew their words might inflame revenge, or understood that describing certain things is itself a kind of violence passed forward. So the exact acts become blurred in the record, not because nothing happened, but because what happened was too corrosive to place neatly into ink. And then, when the royal household had been broken and displayed, the Caliph himself was killed in the way that would become infamous. Wrapped, crushed, suffocated, his death engineered to avoid bloodshed, while maximizing symbolism. The conquerors didn't just execute him. They made him disappear beneath weight. In some versions, a platform is placed over him. A feast is held above him. Men eat, laugh, celebrate while the last Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad dies in darkness beneath their feet. Whether every dramatic element is literal or later embellished, the meaning is unmistakable. The Mongols turned the Caliph's end into a ritual inversion. The man who once sat above everyone now lay below everyone. The palace that once lifted him now became the stage for his humiliation. And when that ended, Baghdad's suffering did not end with it. The fall of the palace was only the opening of the gates. The city that had once represented a civilization's memory became a killing ground. Streets clogged. Homes were emptied. People who had never spoken to one another in life, merchant and scholar, child and old man, were thrown into the same silence. And alongside the bodies came another death, the death of written knowledge. Libraries were burned. Manuscripts were destroyed. Books were thrown into the river, and later generations would speak sometimes literally, sometimes symbolically, of darkened water, ink bleeding into current, a city's mind emptied into the Tigris. Here is where one human anchor can help us feel what this meant. Imagine a scribe, let's call him Yusuf, no hero, no warrior, just a man whose hands smell of ink and glue. He has spent his life copying texts that he believes will outlive him. On ordinary days he argues over punctuation as if it matters more than politics. Now he crouches in a shadowed stairwell, listening to the city above him break into screams. He hears boots. He hears laughter. He hears a door collapse. He hears someone bargaining money offered, jewelry offered, a daughter offered, anything offered to make the universe reverse. And he realizes with a clarity that feels like ice that none of it matters. Not wealth, not status, not scholarship, not piety, not beauty, because the men who have entered the city are not here to negotiate with the values that made Baghdad Baghdad. They are here to replace those values with a single lesson. We can do this to the greatest city you know. When you conquer a place like Baghdad, you don't just take territory. You take confidence from everyone who ever looked to that city as a center of gravity. Baghdad wasn't only a capital. It was a signal. It told the world civilization can be organized. Learning can be protected. Power can be clothed in law. After 1258, that signal flickered. And what survived, what always survives, were fragments. Not whole archives, not complete truth, but pieces. A chronicler's stunned sentence. A rumor passed along a trade route. A survivor's refusal to forget. History doesn't preserve the scream. It preserves the echo. In the months after, the psychological damage radiated outward. Rulers in distant cities heard the story and weighed their options. Some surrendered faster than they otherwise would have. Some overbuilt walls. Some hid wealth. Some distrusted scholars. Some, quietly, began to fear that libraries made you a target. And that's one of the strangest legacies. The destruction of Baghdad wasn't only a loss of books. It was a change in how people thought about knowledge itself. The idea that learning was a divine ornament began to compete with a darker idea. Learning is a liability if it attracts predators. But even the Mongols couldn't fully conquer what they accidentally created, a myth of terror so powerful it outlived them. Centuries later, the Mongol Empire fragmented. Dynasties rose and fell. New capitals claimed prestige. New scholars built new libraries. Yet the story of Baghdad's fall remained like a scar that keeps aching when the weather changes. And the royal family, once the untouchable center of a world, became the clearest symbol of that reversal. Because think about the opening again, the silent fountains. A city's water fell quiet before its people did. The first warning wasn't a trumpet or a flame, it was absence. The sound that should have been there wasn't. That is how catastrophe often enters history. Not as a sudden explosion, but as a subtraction, a small missing thing, a certainty that fails to appear. And then, once you notice the silence, you can't unnotice it. By dawn after the conquest, Baghdad was still standing as architecture. But the Baghdad that mattered, the Baghdad of confidence, scholarship, continuity, had been shattered. Survivors walked through streets that no longer felt like streets, but like the inside of a broken memory. They stepped around pages torn loose from books, ink bleeding into dust, words becoming litter. They remembered, they recorded, they could not look away. And somewhere in the ruins the idea of a caliphate, an unbroken sacred line, lay wrapped in the same kind of silence as those fountains, not loudly ended, simply unable to speak. In the end, the most haunting truth isn't only what the Mongols did to Baghdad's royal family. It's that the world watched a symbol die and then kept living anyway. The river kept moving. The sun rose. The wind still carried dust through empty courtyards. And the palace, once a place of prayers and protocol, became just another structure where something unspeakable had happened. As if history itself had learned a brutal new language, that even the most sacred crown is still made of matter, and matter breaks,